In this episode, we are going to take internal security policies out of the realm of vague corporate writing and make them understandable as practical tools that shape daily behavior and hold up when someone asks, "Who decided this, and how do we know it is being followed?" Beginners often imagine a policy as a long document that exists mainly to satisfy auditors, but a policy is supposed to do three concrete jobs at once: clearly communicate expectations, create enforceable authority for consistent decisions, and support auditability through evidence. Clarity means people can read it and understand what is required without guessing or needing to interpret it like a legal contract. Enforceable means the policy is realistic and connected to governance, so it can actually be applied, including how exceptions are handled and what happens when requirements are ignored. Auditable means the policy is written in a way that allows the organization to demonstrate compliance, not through promises, but through observable behavior and records. Policies that fail in any of these areas create problems. Unclear policies lead to inconsistent behavior. Unenforceable policies lead to workarounds and quiet noncompliance, and unauditable policies lead to stressful, last-minute evidence scrambles. A mature security program treats policy as a foundation for consistent decision-making, not as a decorative document. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A clear policy starts with purpose, scope, and audience, because a policy that tries to speak to everyone at once often ends up speaking clearly to no one. Purpose answers why the policy exists and what risk or obligation it addresses in plain language. Scope answers what parts of the organization, what data, what systems, or what behaviors are covered, because scope prevents the policy from being applied incorrectly. Audience answers who is expected to follow the policy and who is expected to own and enforce it. Beginners sometimes think clarity is only about simpler wording, but clarity also comes from good structure. A policy should define key terms that are easy to misunderstand, such as what counts as sensitive data, what counts as authorized access, or what counts as an exception. It should also distinguish requirements from guidance, because mixing them creates confusion about what is mandatory. When a policy is structured well, people can find what applies to them quickly. That reduces resistance because confusion is a major source of frustration. Clarity is therefore not a style preference. It is a behavior enabler. Enforceability begins with realism, because a policy that demands unrealistic behavior will be ignored, and ignored policies are worse than missing policies because they create false confidence. To be enforceable, a policy must reflect how the organization actually works and the constraints teams face. This does not mean lowering standards until everything is easy. It means designing requirements that are achievable and providing paths for meeting them. For example, a policy can require that sensitive data be stored only in approved locations, but then the organization must actually provide approved locations that are usable. A policy can require that access be reviewed, but then there must be a realistic review process with clear owners and reasonable timelines. Enforceability also depends on leadership support, because enforcement without sponsorship turns security into a powerless advisor or an unpopular police force. A policy must be connected to governance so that decision authority is clear and so that when conflicts occur, there is a legitimate escalation path. Beginners sometimes assume enforcement is about punishment, but enforcement is mostly about consistency. The same expectations apply across teams, and exceptions are visible and controlled rather than informal. When enforcement is consistent, trust increases and workarounds decrease. Auditable policies are written with evidence in mind, and this is where many policies quietly fail. A policy that says systems should be secure is not auditable because it does not define what secure means or what evidence would show it. Auditable policies include requirements that can be observed, measured, or documented. For example, a policy might require that access is granted based on role and reviewed periodically, which implies evidence like access review records and role definitions. A policy might require that incidents are reported and managed through a defined process, which implies evidence like incident records and response procedures. A policy might require that sensitive data is classified and protected accordingly, which implies evidence like classification guidelines, data handling procedures, and access control records. Beginners sometimes fear auditability because it sounds like bureaucracy, but auditability is really about accountability and learning. If you cannot show evidence, you cannot know whether the policy is working, and you cannot improve it reliably. Auditability also protects the organization during external review because it demonstrates due care. A policy that supports evidence reduces stress because it makes compliance routine rather than a last-minute scramble. To make a policy clear and enforceable, it helps to understand the relationship between policy, standards, and procedures, even though we will keep the focus on policy itself here. Policy is the statement of what must be true, such as access must be controlled or sensitive data must be protected. Standards describe the consistent methods or criteria that satisfy the policy, such as baseline requirements for authentication or logging. Procedures describe how people carry out the work, such as how to request access or how to report an incident. A policy should not try to contain all the technical detail of standards and procedures, because that makes it hard to maintain and harder for beginners to follow. Instead, a policy should point toward the existence of standards and procedures and clarify ownership and enforcement. Beginners often write policies that read like step-by-step instructions, which makes them brittle because technology and processes change. A well-structured policy stays stable while standards and procedures evolve. That stability supports enforceability because the organization is not constantly rewriting the core rules. It also supports auditability because evidence can be mapped to stable expectations. Another beginner misunderstanding is that policies are primarily for security teams, but in reality policies are for the entire organization. That means policies must be written in a way that non-security roles can understand and apply. For instance, an employee should be able to understand what data handling expectations apply to them. A manager should understand what approval responsibilities they have, and a system owner should understand what baseline expectations exist. Policies should avoid excessive jargon and should use consistent terms across documents. They should also avoid contradictions, because contradictory policies create loopholes and confusion. One useful approach is to treat policies as decision boundaries. They define what is allowed, what is required, and what requires explicit approval. This framing helps people apply policies in daily work because it turns policy into a set of clear decision rules. It also reduces the perception that policies exist only to punish, because decision boundaries can be explained as protections for the organization and for employees. Clear boundaries reduce fear and reduce guesswork, which improves security behavior. Exception handling is another part of enforceability that must be designed into policy, because exceptions will happen in real organizations. A policy that ignores exceptions forces people to break the rules quietly, while a policy that allows unlimited exceptions destroys itself. A mature policy defines how exceptions are requested, who can approve them, what information must be included, and how long the exception lasts before review. It also defines what compensating controls might be required, meaning alternative protections that reduce risk when the standard requirement cannot be met. Beginners sometimes think exceptions are a sign of weakness, but exceptions are a governance tool when handled transparently. Transparent exceptions preserve accountability because a risk owner must explicitly accept the risk and own the consequences. They also create data for improvement because repeated exceptions can reveal that a requirement is unrealistic or that a capability gap exists. When policies include clear exception pathways, they become more enforceable because people have a legitimate way to handle constraints. They also become more auditable because exceptions are documented rather than hidden. Policy quality also depends on alignment with organizational goals and values, because policies that feel disconnected are more likely to be ignored. If an organization values customer trust, policies should be framed as protecting that trust through careful data handling and reliable service protection. If an organization values efficiency, policies should be designed to reduce rework and incident cost, not to add unnecessary steps. Alignment also helps leaders support enforcement, because they can defend policies as supporting the mission rather than as arbitrary restrictions. Beginners sometimes assume policy language must sound strict to be taken seriously, but overly harsh language can create resistance and fear. A better approach is firm clarity with respectful tone, emphasizing that policy supports safe and effective operation. When people feel respected and understand why policies exist, they cooperate more reliably. Cooperation is a major part of enforcement because enforcement cannot rely solely on punishment in large organizations. Policies work when they are integrated into processes and reinforced through leadership behavior. Finally, policies must be maintained because a policy that is outdated becomes unenforceable and unauditable over time. Maintenance includes periodic review, updating references to standards and procedures, and adjusting requirements when business context changes. It also includes learning from incidents and audit findings, because those events reveal where policies were unclear or unrealistic. A mature program treats policy review as routine governance rather than as an emergency response to an audit. When policies are maintained, teams trust them because they reflect current reality. When policies are neglected, teams invent their own rules, which increases inconsistency and risk. Maintenance also supports auditability because evidence remains aligned with expectations. Beginners sometimes fear changing policies because it feels like admitting the old policy was wrong, but updating policy is normal when conditions change. The key is to update deliberately through governance and communicate changes clearly so people understand what is expected. Stability with thoughtful updates is what makes policy both trustworthy and usable. In conclusion, establishing internal policies that are clear, enforceable, and auditable is about creating documents that guide real behavior, support legitimate enforcement, and produce evidence that the organization can demonstrate consistently. Clarity comes from strong structure, plain language, defined scope, and clear requirements that reduce guesswork for different roles. Enforceability comes from realistic expectations, leadership support, governance linkage, and transparent exception handling that preserves accountability without encouraging hidden rule-breaking. Auditability comes from writing requirements that imply observable evidence, allowing the program to measure adoption, learn from results, and reduce last-minute compliance chaos. Policies must stay connected to standards and procedures without becoming overloaded with technical detail, and they must be maintained so they reflect current risks and operations. When policies are treated as decision boundaries and operational foundations rather than as decorative paperwork, they become one of the most powerful tools for building consistent security behavior across the enterprise.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.